Good morning. I'm so used to saying Shabbat Shalom, but I guess it's Shabbat Shalom for all of us here, which is a good Sabbath. My name is Rabbi Miriam Terlinchamp, and I thank you, Pastor Jana, for this invitation to speak. You're a source of strength and grounding in so many of our places, and so I'm honored to be here with the Knox community. It's great to see Douglas, and I'm missing Pastor Adam, of course, but I'm so thankful to be able to share with you these words. So I wanted to start with a poem that I wrote recently, and it'll just be on the screen as I read it. I wonder if my neighbors look over at my garden, sighing, remembering the vibrant Japanese maple, the intricate path made of hewn stones, uncorrupted artistries of greens and yellows and sometimes blues. Years of patient labor. Then now a battered landscape thick with fleshy foliage, ravaged in a few short seasons by our neglect. How their hearts must sigh, watching a curated masterpiece become untamed. Perhaps in the same way God looks over at her garden, sighing, remembering when the battle was just over a couple of trees and how every creature had a name, a purpose, a time, and now without that careful attention, this garden became unbridled, turbulent, more thorn than bridle. In my garden, now birds and rabbits and snakes and frogs govern the feral grounds. How uncivilized, barbarous, overrun, letting the earth have her land back. Trying, this time, for the wilderness to lead us, unfurling into grace. Our joint tradition teaches that there are two trees in the Garden of Eden, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. Genesis 3:6 reads, "Vatera ha'isha ki tov ha'etz lema'achal v'chi ta'avahu le'einayim." When the woman saw the tree was good for eating, and that it opened your eyes to wisdom, vatochal vatiten gam le'isha im'a vayochal. She ate it, and she offered it to the man, and he also ate. Our Jewish tradition teaches that this first moment of consciousness is the moment when awareness enters the human psyche. Some have called this moment the first or original sin, as it is the first act of defiance of humankind against God. And the majority of stories in our Hebrew Bible involve humanity resisting and defying God. It's part of our human-God banter. We humans mess up. God grumbles about our natural inclination to mess things up. We're punished for messing up. We repent, and then the cycle just starts all over again. And as far as sins go, this isn't a sin that's very interesting. It's not just unique to Eden. It's just part of who we are as humans. I think much more compelling in the story of Eden is the active choice made around knowledge. This is the first choice that humanity actually makes, the choice of open eyes, which is no picnic. So we just try to tell it a different way, that Mother Eve passed on sin and pain and cast us out into the wilderness. Knowledge is no gift, it's suffering. Those stories of sin and rejection, those are the ones we tell so we can avoid reality. Pretend like we can unsee what we have seen in this world, unknow what we know. However, life is just more interesting than that. The moment when Eve surrenders her right to utopia is the same moment that she sees creation for what it is: death and decay, light and shadow, right and wrong, complexity of beauty and pain in one world. She sees two gardens, and for that seeing power, she's expelled from Eden because blind bliss is impossible. Cast out of Eden and out in the real world, Eve gives birth to twins. And then her son Cain, out of anger or jealousy or mental illness or addiction, we actually never have a good enough reason why. Vayikam Cain et Hevel achi v'hargehu. Cain rose up against his brother and murders him. In the text, we read of Cain's punishment. Remember that, the mark? But we don't know what Eve thought. But I think, and I bet you do too, that Eve had an opinion. And then after Abel died, the mother of all humanity, who had suffered unbearable heartache, had something to say. This is my own exegetical, creative understanding of why we live in the world we live in right now. The Jewish Hasidic masters teach that if your child dies, you are granted automatic entrance into heaven, as there's no suffering as large as the death of a child. Whatever tests lay beyond the grave are no match for the pain of living in the world without your child. So it goes to reason that after the death of Abel, when God is punishing Cain, that God also had time to make a Shiva call, a visitation of the bereaved, to Eve. Seeing her desperate in her mourning, our God, God of compassion and steadfast love, turns to her and says, Eve, you've been through so much. Come stay with me in Eden. It's just around the bend there, not so far at all. All you've done to get cast out is forgotten. Your grief has made expiation for your sin. You're welcome back to Eden, back to utopia. And Eve, eyes bleary and swollen from unrelenting weeping over the loss of her son Abel, thinks of her son Cain and what life is like in this brutal reality of an awakened and wise world. And she responds to the all-powerful, all-knowing, sovereign, and creator of the world, saying, no thanks, I'd rather stay here with my son. This is the second choice that Eve makes for humanity. And even when knowledge is suffering, especially when the world of knowledge is unforgiving, we can't deny what we first felt when we were first awakened. Personally, I connect very deeply with the suffering that accompanies the courage to stay awake in the world. For example, when I first arrived in Cincinnati, it was about 12 years ago, I was called to an aging, financially defunct congregation. And it was clear to me that as a young rabbinical graduate, I hadn't been called there to save it or to wake it up. I was called there to shut it down. In its heyday, the congregation was bursting at the seams, and there were children always in the hallways, and we had double back-to-back Sunday school services because we just couldn't fit them all in. And all of those memories were still really fresh in the minds of our congregation, even as we sat in a dwindling, huge sanctuary. It had been 15 years since that reality, and now the building was too big, with too many needs to make any sense. There weren't any money left in the coffers. So what were we supposed to do? Surrender to the atrophying present because our idea of success was based on the idea of a garden that had long since passed? Or build a new future, a totally different type of community? In our lives, we have to balance what we can do with what we imagine we can do. Is this the garden that I can save? Will I have to do it alone? What will happen to Eden, to the garden, to the congregation if I just walk away? And what role does my faith play in any of this? There's the courage we have to muster just for the sake of surviving, making the impossible choice because in truth there are no other choices. And that's the path of courage that my congregation took at first. We sold our building. We moved. But then we did something different. We didn't try to build another temple. We didn't spend the proceeds on another bigger, nicer version of what we already have. Nor did we choose to save all the proceeds and wait for change to happen to us. Survival was never our goal. There are enough synagogues in this city, enough Jews that can be met other places. But our unique call wasn't to survive, it was to offer something of vision, meaning, and possibility. So we invested our funds into a new vision for community, and we set specific goals, and now 5 years later, the congregation is 60% bigger, it's filled with children's laughter, and we look at our fine results, and we are now faced with a second decision. What does courageous vision and change look like when you're not worried about surviving? When there's enough money and people and contentment to stay the course, why would you change anything? And I guess for me, my answer in my community is that survival and status quo are not ends into themselves. And we need to find courage, both on a personal and communal level, that goes beyond doing things just to survive. galvanizing the courage to tend and nurture, to seed a new garden, planting vegetables and flowers, understanding that the utopian garden of yesteryears is not the goal. Just like the vision of our congregation could no longer be the goal which we aspire, rather finding within us the courage to open ourselves up to what might unfold if we believed that our imagination could take roots. We see a model for this in our biblical texts. After the first temple was destroyed, it took 70 years for us to return from exile. And when we returned, we went right back to building a bigger, better temple. That's where we did all of our sacrifices. That's where we connected with God. And then that temple was destroyed too. And our whole way of practicing the Jewish faith came crashing down. And there are Psalms, of course, from before the destruction and during exile, and even the ones that we read from as we return to our land, grappling with what it means to evolve as a spiritual community. We know that we can do it because we've done it before. And even more, after that second temple was destroyed and we were in exile again, our aspiration was never to come back and build a third temple, to do it exactly the way we've always done it before. Because can you imagine it? Everything that we created and nurtured and imagined between 70 CE and today, with equity and music and story, our rituals, in our case, our Talmud, the whole breadth of the last 2,000 years, could we or would we give it all up so we could go back to the way things were at the very beginning? Let's be honest, there's no returning, not really. Therefore, the only way forward is to actually move forward. And the God we believe in, the tradition we practice, models for us an unbreakable spirit and capacity for change. When our soul is awakened by suffering, by change, by our imagination, by a world upturned by a global pandemic, we feel the tension of living in very different gardens. The garden where the burden of change and growth and care is completely on our shoulders, and the other garden, the one that requires trust in the grace of the natural order of the universe. And in every story, we always have a part, right? That's the whole point of these stories. Are we the rabbi in a congregation, reminding one another of possibility? Are we the neighbors, watching the world crumble, judging, fearful on the sidelines, waiting to be asked to get involved? Are we the owner of the garden, struggling to balance what we want to do with what we're capable of doing? Or in the other garden, the larger one, are we the snake, pushing limits, taking risks regardless of what it costs? Are we Adam, who allows life to happen to him? Are we God, who expects everything to go exactly according to plan? Are we Eve, who chooses truth knowing full well the consequences? Are you unsure? Because I'll tell you who you are. You're Eve. When she bites into that apple, Eve does two things. She commits the first sin, and she makes the first active choice of humanity, the choice of wakefulness in the world. And Eve's bite traveled through the strands of our DNA, flowed into our bloodstream from soul to soul through generations of bodies, whispering to us, not about sin, but rather our duty to awake to truth. And then, if we're lucky, how we can integrate the vulnerability that accompanies all true wisdom that comes into our lives. And we, her children, are not fallen daughters of Eden. We are the sons of a mother who chose awareness instead of benighted paradise. We are inheritors of the gift that wisdom has greater value than perfection. And ever since that moment, when Eve ate from the tree of knowledge, we have been chasing a dream, not of utopian purity, but rather trying to get closer to that first bite of wakefulness. It isn't always clear which garden we're living in, the one that demands surrender of our power, the one that needs us to activate our power. That's something that each of us must answer for our own lives. But when you're standing there, looking at the weeds, staring at the bunnies, wondering if all of this is beyond repair, remember, you don't have to be the observer, the trickster, the all-powerful creator. You get to be Eve and decide how your gifts of choice and actions will change our world. wonder if my neighbors look over at my garden. Sighing, remembering the vibrant Japanese maple, the intricate path made of hewn stones, uncorrupted artistries of greens, yellows, and sometimes blues, years of patient labor. Then now a battered landscape, thick with fleshy foliage, ravaged in a few short seasons by our neglect. How their hearts must sigh, watching a curated masterpiece become untamed. Perhaps in the same way, God looks over at her garden, sighing, remembering when the battle was just over a couple of trees, and how every creature had a name, a purpose, a time, and now without that careful attention, the garden became unbridled, turbulent, more thorn than petal. In my garden now, birds, rabbits, snakes, and frogs govern the feral grounds. How uncivilized, barbarous, overrun, letting the earth have her land back. Trying, this time, for the wilderness to lead us, unfurling into grace.